Our next speaker is Jerry Coyne. His skill that he wished he could have would be to climb Mount Everest. Nice. He would save a custom pair of cowboy boots that he just got. That's what he would pull out of his house. I have to take a look at those at some point. He chose ninjas versus pirates, and he said pie. No question, pie. I think we're almost ready. One final thing before we start the final talk. Bruce told me that the numbers are fantastic, and LogiCal-LA will be back again. So, congratulations. Very exciting. Keep an eye out, obviously, for official announcements of all that kind of stuff. Also, there were people that were asking about resources for some of the comic and graphic novels that we talked about yesterday. You can go to the LogiCal Facebook page, and there's an entire list there of recommendations from that panel. So keep an eye on that Facebook page as well to get information for next year's LogiCal-LA. Very exciting. All right, with a talk that's called Ways of Knowing, Science versus Everything Else, please welcome Jerry Coyne.
Thanks. Maybe they could dim the lights a little. Sorry? Okay. Maybe they could dim the lights a little to where it was before. Yeah, perfect. Okay. And so my talk today is going to be a scientific talk. That is, I'm going to promote a view of science as being better than any other way of knowing in any field, in any place on this planet, and probably in any other planet as well. And the talk's going to be divided into two parts. Let me just start the timer here. The first is, can you read that? Okay, there. So the first question is one that is discussed amongst scientists and people in the humanities, and particularly amongst theologians and religions. Is science the only way of knowing anything about the universe? And the ancillary aspect of that question is, well, what about the humanities, arts, music, mathematics, philosophy, literature, and especially religion? Because all of these have been touted as other ways of knowing, ways that you can find out stuff about the cosmos beyond the methods of science. Part two will be sort of connected to that. It is, are there big questions that science cannot answer, but other areas, and of course religion is the one that's touted most frequently, can answer. You can hear me okay? Yes. Okay, good. And the answer to both of these is, the first one is yes, science is the only way of knowing what the universe. I'll give you and I'll define what I mean by science and knowledge for the philosophers amongst you. And second of all, are there big questions that science can't answer but religion can? The answer to that is no, and I'll try to show you why. I mean, you know this in your heart already. So let me just briefly talk about what I see as the incompatibility between science and religion. A lot of people say that the fact that science and religion are incompatible is instantiated by the fact that we have religious scientists, or we have science-friendly religionists, so they must be compatible. But that's not compatibility, that's compartmentalization. The ability to hold two different ways to approach the verification of knowledge in your mind at the same time, even though those ways are incompatible. So I look at the incompatibility by assuming that, first of all, religion makes epistemic statements about the universe. And I'll try to show that to you with some quotations in a minute. And second of all, once you realize that religion, although it is a way of communing with people, that looking at stained glass windows and finding morality and having a nice coffee with your friends on on Sundays, is also at bottom rests on statements about what's true about the universe. And Christianity is the most familiar one of these. Knowing that, and that religion is based on statements that are at least in principle verifiable, there are three ways that science and religion are incompatible. They're in some ways competitors in knowing things that are true about the universe. It's just that one of them works, which is science, and the other one doesn't work, which is religion, and it turns it into a kind of pseudoscience. The first incompatibility, and these are all written in my latest book, Faith versus Fact, available at fine bookstores everywhere, as Hitchens used to say. Unfortunately, not at this one. Is a methodological incompatibility. That is, the way that science and religion investigate the truth is very different. There's an outcome incompatibility. The outcome of their researches and finding out what is true differs between science and religion. And finally, and I'm not going to talk about this much, there's a philosophical incompatibility. There is an atheism built into the structure of scientific investigation. The refusal to entertain supernatural hypotheses. That is not an a priori commitment. That is a result of 400 years of science telling us that accepting the supernatural as a possible cause has never gotten us anywhere in trying to understand the universe. But I won't talk about that philosophy beyond that. You can read it in my book. Now, it doesn't take much digging into the literature of theology, and God forbid any digging into the literature of theology is a painful experience. But if you find an honest theologian, and that's almost an oxymoron, I think, so you will see that they will admit, when pressed, that yes, my religion is at bottom based on statements about what is true about the universe. And here's two statements by very famous science advocates and scientists. Ian Barber is the founder of science studies and philosophy, and Carl Garberson and Francis Collins are both scientists. Collins, as you know, is head of the National Institutes of Health. And look at these statements. I mean, they say, yes, religion is about a way of life and not a set of abstract ideas, but it presupposes statements about the nature of reality and cannot be sustained if those beliefs are no longer credible. Two more other honest religionists. I won't read these statements. You can read them yourself. Religion often makes claims about the way things are. It does. I mean, what is a Christian? Is somebody a Christian if they don't believe that Jesus existed as the divine Son of God and was resurrected to atone for our sins? You can hardly call yourself a Christian if you do not believe in at least those kinds of miracles. And in fact, the Bible itself in 1 Corinthians makes the statement, if Christ be not risen, then is our preaching vain and your faith is in vain. This shows that the whole moral and spiritual and theological basis of Christianity rests on the empirical fact of Christ being crucified and risen. So you can see this over and over again, and you realize very quickly that religion at bottom, if it is to be accepted, is based on you accepting certain things that are true about the universe. And if you don't believe that, just take a look at this survey about what Americans believe. This is a 2013 Harris poll, and these are all Americans, not just a subset of religious Americans. If you survey all Americans and ask them whether they accept these things, or believe them is more accurate, you'll see that, you know, a majority of them believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, that he was resurrected, that there's miracles, that heaven exists. 58% of them believe in hell and Satan. 68% of them believe in angels. That's 3 times more people than believe in naturalistic evolution. And so all of these things are statements that are, at least in principle, approachable by the tools of science. These are the undergirdings of people's religious beliefs. And so if you're going to make a statement that you believe in stuff like this, then you have to support it with evidence of some sort. The problem is that the kind of evidence religion uses is different from the way that the kind of evidence that science uses. And that's where we get to these methodological incompatibilities between the two. In science, and this is the best way I know how to sum it up, and this is the only bon mot I've ever made up in my life. I'm quite proud of it, actually. In science, faith is a vice. In religion, faith is a virtue, okay? And by faith, I mean faith in the terms of the Princeton philosopher Walter Kaufman, confident and assertive belief in things for which the average person would not give a cent. To say more simply, it's belief in stuff that you know ain't so, which is Mark Twain's definition of faith, and it's the Bible's definition of faith, as I think Seth Andrews told us earlier today. In science, you have a way of knowing. You have ways of finding out that you're wrong. It's built into the structure of science. You do hypothesis testing. You make predictions. You use statistics. You're always inquiring nature. There's a pervasive culture of doubt. It's like a bunch of piranhas in there, if you're a scientist, tearing each other apart, trying to get at the truth. So in science, you have ways of knowing if you're wrong. If you ask a Christian, what would convince you that Jesus was not resurrected? The answer more often than not would be nothing, absolutely nothing. And in fact, Carl Garberson, who's a physicist and used to be vice president of BioLogos, said even if there was a camera in the tomb and it showed Jesus just laying there and rotting, I would still believe that he would have been resurrected. Okay, you can't get much more anti-scientific than that. So that's one of the methodological incompatibilities. Science relies on dogma, authority, revelation, and scripture as its way of investigating the truth. What you feel is true is true. What you read is true is true. Religion has, I mean, science, as you know, and I don't have to lecture you about how science is done, Don just did that, has a completely different way of doing it. There's also incompatibilities of outcomes. That is, if you investigate what the truth is through revelation, dogma, scripture, and authority, you will believe things that are not verified by science. Here's just certain outcomes that have come from the investigation of the Old Testament and more modern religious beliefs. The creation story that Jeannie just talked about, the exodus from Egypt didn't happen, Adam and Eve didn't happen, the Great Flood didn't happen, efficacy of prayer widely believed, scientific tests show doesn't work, and of course the 6,000-year-old Earth is just a fiction. So, you know, so again, this is an incompatibility between science and religion, but not in the methodology. It's the outcome of what you decide is true using your methodology of religion. Now, this shows that science and religion are incompatible in this way, but it also shows something much more profound, which is that religion is not only incompatible with science, it's incompatible with other religions. Because every religion has a different belief of what is true using the same methods of investigation, revelation, scripture, and authority. It's not a way of knowing because the different, you know, whereas different scientists will always come to the same conclusion over time through consensus investigation, religions aren't like that. And so, for example, we can do this diagram of the history of religion over time. This looks very similar to a phylogeny of animals that you've seen if you're a biology person. But instead we see this is the 20,000-year history of religions dividing up over time. So at the top, for example, we have Christianity. And this is only a small subset of the existing religions. There's probably 60 to 100,000 different religious sects, depending on how you divide them on this planet. 41,000 denominations of Christianity alone. That's estimated by the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, so it's not, you know, it's kosher. And so you see, well, okay, not kosher, whatever the Christian word for kosher is. But you can see that starting 20,000 years over at the left, the religion's splitting. Christianity is at the top. Those three green bars below it are Islam, Sunni, Sufi, and Shia, but of course there's many more subdivisions of Islam. That lone, lonely yellow line, that's Judaism. But of course there's branches of Judaism, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, etc. And then below that we have the Southeast Asian, Australian, and African religions as well. The point I'm trying to make with this is that every time there's a split there, a split that, if this was a biological phylogeny, would correspond to a speciation event, it usually corresponds to a difference about what you conceive to be true. And so when a religion decides that, you know, for example, that there's not a trinity, and the other sect says there is a trinity, then you're going to have a split. And so this kind of splitting over time shows clearer than anything else, I think, that religion has no way of homing in on what is true. And these schisms involve things like, how many gods are there? Are you polytheistic or monotheistic? Is Jesus the Son of God, a prophet? If you're a Christian, you have to believe that. If you're a Muslim, you're going to be killed for believing that. Incompatible ways of seeing the truth. Is there an afterlife? Well, for most religions, yes, but not for the Jews. If you read the Old Testament, you just go to sleep. Okay, and that's it for you. Can gays are gays immoral? Can women be priests? Can you give a blood donation? Is evolution true? Each one of these things, and the last one, evolution, has actually split the Lutheran Church into two different things. So this kind of repeated splitting and splitting and splitting shows more than anything else that religion has no way of homing in on what's true about anything even elementary as the number of gods that there are, much less the nature of those gods. Now contrast this with the phylogeny of science. That's it at the bottom. What we have here is basically a straight line which over time approaches closer and closer approximation to understanding what is true. It is our best understanding of the universe. We never arrive, as Sean said last night, at the absolute truth, but we get closer to it. But we have these little side branches that can represent, you know, divisive other theories that have been shown to be wrong after a certain amount of time. So over on the extreme right, that little branch might be string theory, which is a hypothesis. We have not found a way to test it yet. Past that, it might be the theory that continents did not move, which was refuted just in my lifetime. Okay. So here we have an example of the incompatibility of outcomes of the investigations of religion versus science. Okay, so now we'll get to the meat of this talk, ways of knowing. Is science the only way of knowing things about the universe? And that's what I mean when I say knowing. Knowing what is true about the universe. Not just the planet, but the universe as a whole. Or the cosmos, if you will. And to answer this question, I'm going to rely on Sean Carroll's 3 Tenets of Naturalism, which, how many of you read his book, The Big Picture? Very good book. I recommend it highly. You saw a précis of it last night. A very abbreviated one. This is his 3 Tenets of Naturalism, which is, of course, the basis of science. There's only one world, the natural world. That world evolves according to unbroken patterns, the laws of nature. And finally, the important one, the only reliable way of learning about the world is by observing it. Okay? Now that itself answers, that's my whole lecture, basically. I could just sit down right now and say, well, if you construe science as the only reliable way of observing and concluding about the world, then it's got to be the only way of knowing about the world. But I have to go deeper because I have more time to talk, so I'll do that. But, you know, I'm not the only person to take this point of view. It's just that the idea of ways of knowing, which is brooded about so often by theologists, and especially by people in the humanities who are desperately determined to defend their turf against the encroachment of science, will maintain that, yes, we too in literature, we too in music, we too in art are adumbrating ways of knowing about the universe. Okay, so before I go on to looking at the ways of knowledge, let me define my terms. I'm not a philosopher, but I'll just give you my best best. So I have to tell you what science is, because I'm going to tell you that science is the only way of knowing reliable things about the cosmos. I'll have to tell you what truth is, and I have to tell you what knowledge is, because I'm saying science is the only reliable way of knowing about the universe. So here's my definition of science. You can conceive of science in many ways. The job I do is science when I go to work every day, or at least I did until last September. You could conceive of it as the body of knowledge that science produces. You know, chemistry, physics, etc. I prefer, and for this purposes of this lecture, we'll conceive of it as what I call science broadly construed. It is not a body of knowledge, it is not a job, it is a toolkit, a way of investigating what is true about nature, as close as we can get to the best approximation of truth. And that toolkit, as you know, as I just said, involves doubt, it involves hypothesis testing, it involves looking at nature, it involves consensus amongst people, different observers, and using, as God said yesterday, a lot of different methods to try to converge to a truth. And in the more esoteric forms refined in academic science, you use things like double-blind testing, statistics, anonymous peer review, and so on. And so here we see a scientist doing science, but I would add, and people like Massimo Pigliucci will disagree with me strenuously, I think he's wrong, that a plumber is doing science when he's trying to find a leak in your sink. Steve Gould wrote a famous essay on this about the Arkansas trial, when he came back from the trial and he saw this plumber trying to find out where the leak was in his toilet. And then he was using all kinds of hydrodynamic principles in science. And here was a man that was actually doing science trying to fix his toilet. Steve engaged him in conversation and found out he was also a young Earth creationist. And so he saw this profound dissonance between that guy who was actually doing what I call science broadly construed, and then what he believed in terms of the age of the Earth. A guy that's trying to find out where an electrical circuit in your car has gone wrong is doing science broadly construed, because they make hypotheses. Maybe the breakage is here, maybe the breakage is here. I'll do this test, or maybe I'll do that test. Or maybe if I fix this wire, it will do that. That's a form of science. I mean, you don't think of these people as scientists, but they are using science broadly construed. And so are things like archaeologists, for example. How many people can you really deny that archaeology is a science? These are people whose lives are dedicated to finding out about the nature of ancient civilizations, about the age of ancient civilizations, and they do it scientifically, as you say here. The best archaeologists are the ones that are the most meticulous and use the methods of science to do that. So this is what I call science broadly construed. What is truth? Well, I use the Oxford English Dictionary as my definition of what is truth because nobody can argue with what the Oxford English Dictionary says. I mean, I can say it, and nobody ever has. And so here's their definition of what truth is: conformity with fact, agreement with reality, accuracy, correctness, verity of statement or thought. In other words, it's what is, okay? And it is what is that can be ascertained what it is. Now, if you ask what conformity of fact is, then you get into this sort of endless spiral because conformity with fact is truth, and truth is conformity with fact, but everybody knows what I mean. This is Steve Gould's definition of what a fact is: a truth confirmed to such a degree that it would be perverse to withhold provisional assent. In other words, okay, and this, I can't remember where he used this, but it was in one of his essays, and it gives the sense of consensus, which is so important in science, that for something to be considered a truth in science, it has to be so well verified that you would be considered perverse or blinkered or religious in order to reject that, okay? So this is what I'm going to consider to be truth. And of course, truth elides into knowledge. What is knowledge? Knowledge is simply the acceptance of truth, the consensus acceptance of what people have found out to be the best explanation of what is the case in nature. So what I'm asking when I'm asking the question, is science the only way, or are there other ways of knowing about the universe besides science? I'm asking this question: is there any other way to grasp consensus truth about the universe besides using the methods of science broadly construed as I define it? Okay? Everybody with me? It's not rocket science. And the answer to this is no. Okay? And I'm going to run through some of these areas that have been brooded about as ways of knowing and try to tell you which ones are good ways of knowing and which ways are not good ways of knowing. And I've divided them up into several areas here. The blue ones are sort of the social sciences. The green ones are what I call the logical sciences, or areas of logic, philosophy, and math. The humanities, the great sticking point, are in orange. And we have the truth from personal feelings. I know my wife loves me. That's in purple. And finally, the truth is coming from religion. And I'll take each of these separately, but I'll go through them fairly quickly. Okay. These four areas, which are what I call the social sciences, are, when used properly, good ways of acquiring knowledge, and they are all sciences when broadly construed. Social science, as God Saad, I don't know if he's here or pronounced it properly, said yesterday, is a way of finding out consensus truth about human behavior if it's done properly, and you have a number of independent lines of investigation that converge on a truth. For example, the 0.7 waist-to-hip ratio that he talked about yesterday that angered some people. History is science if you do it properly. For example, we know Julius Caesar lived. How do we know he lived? Because we have a number of independent lines of evidence for Julius Caesar. His image on coins, his image on statues, his own writings, and the writings of his contemporaries. In fact, we have a gazillion times more evidence for the existence of Julius Caesar than we do for the existence of any person on which Jesus was based. But I won't get into that, okay? It's the same thing with Holocaust denialism. Holocaust denialism was refuted by science. Science broadly construed the finding of potassium cyanide residues on the walls of gas chambers, the orders to order Cyclone B, the statements of the Sonderkommando, and the witnesses and things like that all converge to the view that yes, the Holocaust did happen, plus there's that annoying absence of 6 million Jews after the war. Okay, and that's a scientific investigation, but it's also history. And so this gives you the lie not only to the fact that history isn't science, but also to the people like, I'm not sure it's Ken Ham, who's the other guy who goes around saying that historical science isn't. Yeah, Ray Comfort, that's his big deal, you know. You have to be able to see evolution in order to believe it, and history is not relevant. But of course, if that were true, then no history would be believable at all, because we weren't there, for example, to see the Civil War or World War I. And World War II is rapidly passing out of the realm of reality because the people that actually saw it are dying off. Anthropology and archaeology can be science. These are ways of knowing, and they have produced knowledge. Economics, although it's called the dismal science, is also a way of knowing. Although it tends to be a little soft compared to things like chemistry or physics, there are some reliable facts about nature that we can get from economics, or at least about human behavior. One is the declining demand curve with supply. The more you have of something, the less you want of it. I mean, if you give somebody a donut and they're hungry, they'll like it. If you give them 500 donuts and offer them 500 more, they're not going to want them, okay? This is almost the universal law of economics, and I've had several economics people verify this to me. Philosophy and mathematics. Now, are these ways of knowing? Raise your hand if you think they are. No? Ways of knowing anything about the universe? There's a few people out there. I would say they're ways of knowing, but they're not ways of knowing about a reality. Philosophy and mathematics are very similar in that they are logical, they're systems of logic, and what is true within these systems of logic are the ineluctable consequences of accepting the axioms of logic. You don't see truths about nature when you investigate mathematics. You see truths that follow ineluctably from the axioms that you have accepted from the very beginning. And so that's why in philosophy and mathematics we speak of proof. We can say, well, I've proved Fermat/theorem, or I've proved this, I've proved that. We don't say that in science, because we, as you know, we never, as Sean said, we never arrive at any kind of absolute truth. So philosophy and mathematics are, well, they're useful tools in science, particularly mathematics, without which we could not do things like physics and chemistry, although Darwin's origin does not have a single equation in it. You don't always have to have math to do good science. Philosophy and mathematics, though, are essential tools, particularly math and good science, but they are not ways of understanding the universe. They are tools to help us understand the universe. Nevertheless, they are ways of knowing not about the world, but ways of knowing about what's true within the logical system that you have set up. So, for example, it would be foolish to say that it is not knowledge that the ratio of a diameter of a circle to its circumference is pi. That is knowledge, but it's not knowledge about nature. It's not knowledge about the world. It's not knowledge about cosmos. It's knowledge about the system of mathematics that has been set up by humans. So I'm willing to accept to a limited extent that math, more than philosophy, but both of them are ways of knowing something, but not ways of knowing anything about our cosmos and universe. Now here's the sticking point: literature, art, and music. Humanities people say we have ways of knowing. There are things that you can learn from literature, things you can learn from art, things you can learn from music that are not accessible to science. And I've gotten into a long argument with Adam Gopnik of the New Yorker about this, who's told me repeatedly that yes, literature is a way of knowing. I won't give you the examples that he's brooded about because we're going to have a written exchange on this, and I want to save my ammunition until then. But I want to tell you why I think they're not ways of knowing. Okay, why the humanities, well, and they're valuable. I mean, I love literature as much as anybody, maybe more than most scientists in art and music, but I don't think they're ways of helping us understand the universe. Okay? Now, there are some ways that they can help us understand the universe. First of all, they can tell us how things are. So if you look at Moby Dick, for example, by Herman Melville, it tells you about what whaling was like in the 19th century. Okay? So you can learn something about what whaling is like. Can you believe it, though? Did he just make this up out of his head? Well, we know Herman Melville was actually a whaler for a while. He went on these whaling ships, but we can also verify this by looking at other accounts of how whaling was done off of New England in the 19th century. So the methodology for catching the great white whale that was laid out in this book can be verified, but it has to be verified by science. Here's another example of something that you can learn, knowledge that you can get from art. Here's a picture of Philip IV of Spain by Velázquez. If you know anything about the Habsburgs, he's one of the Habsburgs. You know they have these protruding lower lips called the Habsburg lip. It's actually a genetic deformity or genetic condition called mandibular prognathism. And from seeing this picture, we see that this guy had this. Now, can we believe it? And the answer is yes, because we have a lot of written accounts of Philip IV and his Habsburg relatives saying that, yeah, they had this weird lower lip sticking out. So yeah, from literature, even from fiction, and you know, at least Moby Dick is fiction, we can learn stuff that's true, but we can only verify that truth through independent empirical observation, which is science broadly construed. So literature or fiction cannot tell us what's true unless we have a scientific empirical way to go back and check about what they say is true. The same thing with art, because after all, they could just be making stuff up. James Woods, a professor at Harvard, also a writer from New Yorker, I asked him to tell me what example from literature he could tell me of a truth that could be conveyed only through literature and not through science. And the example he used was The Death of Ivan Ilyich, the book by Tolstoy. How many of you have read this book? If you haven't, you should. It's really great. It's a short novella about the death of a Russian nobleman, how he has, he falls off a ladder, he hurts himself, he probably gets some kind of cancer, and then he dies a slow, painful death. And it's all about his feelings of his death, and ultimately his reconciliation to his death as he realizes his led a moral life. This was and still is taught in medical schools in the United States to teach med students what it's like to die. Okay, so it was seen then to convey knowledge, but does it? Is this what it's really like to die? How do you know? After all, Tolstoy made this up, right? Well, you have to look at lots of cases of people dying and see if there's any commonality in how they die. And when you do that, you find it's very different. This does not teach how it's like to die. This teaches what it was in Tolstoy's imagination, perhaps based on some observation of what it was like for him to watch somebody die, or what he imagined it would be like for somebody to die. So what we have here is not a way of knowing, unless you can get some kind of empirical verification through the methods of science broadly construed. This, by the way, gave rise to my favorite foreign movie of all time by Kurosawa. I don't know how many of you know this, but again, you should see this. It's called Ikuru, which means to live. And it's directly traceable to the death of Ivan Ilyich. It's about a Japanese bureaucrat named Kanji Watanabe who's wasted his life shuffling papers in post-war Japan. The movie was made in '52, and he's diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. That's the trope between Ivan Ilyich and this. And he realizes he's wasted his life shuffling papers. How does he redeem his life, knowing he only has a limited time left? He builds a playground for children. In the last scene of the movie, he's sitting on the swing in the snow, humming to himself. His life has been fulfilled. Okay, it brings you to tears. It almost brings me to tears to describe it now because it's such an ineffably beautiful movie. But is it a way of knowing? Is it a way of knowing how you reconcile the end of your life with and find peace with yourself? And the answer is no, because everybody does it in a different way. If I was diagnosed with stomach cancer, I would not build a playground. I'd probably go to Antarctica and look at the penguins or something like that. Everybody deals with it the same way. So what I'm trying to say here is that this is not a way of knowing, it's a way of feeling. That when we have literature like this and we describe how somebody feels or reacts to a situation, it allows us to step into their shoes, get a bit of empathy with them, and then perhaps enlarge our humanity by perhaps getting some fellow feeling with other people. So I would say that art is not a way of knowing anything about the universe, except incidentally, and then it has to be confirmed. It's a way of feeling. It's a way, and it enriches our lives, make no mistake about that. It's just not a way of understanding about the universe. And if you think it is, you tell me one piece of knowledge about the universe that has come from the humanities, has come from literature, that has not been found by science or does not require verification by science. This is sort of a Hitchens challenge to the humanities, and I've never had a positive answer to that. Okay, we'll have to move on. Also, what about diverging interpretations? I mean, art and literature, there's no one interpretation of many, many things of them. Look at the left, one of my favorite paintings, the Isenheim altarpiece by Matthias Grunewald in Colmar in Alsace. Beautiful painting of the crucifixion. It's a triptych, actually. And it glorifies the death of Christ. It was meant to sit in a hospital and show the dying patients what they were in for and that they better repent. But it was meant to redound to the glory of Christianity. Okay, so that's one thing you could get from this, but then here's on the left is the alternative view. It's Piss Christ by the Spanish artist Andres Serrano, where he immersed a crucifix, a plastic crucifix, in a beaker of his own urine. Okay, this was to mock Christianity. So which is it? Is Christianity glorified? Does it give you a heartening feeling? Does it redound to the greatness of God? Or is it just a plastic crucifix in a beaker of piss? And the answer is, it depends. There's no truth there. There's the way that different people react to things. Same thing with war. You can see war glorified in art on the left here with Napoleon. Or you can see Guernica by Picasso on the right, which is, of course, about the horrors of war. Again, you don't know. All you can do is have an emotional reaction to these things. It doesn't tell you anything objective about the universe. If you want to know if people die in war, you'd best look it up from a historian. Here's Leni Riefenstahl. For some reason, they spelled her name wrong. Her famous movie, Triumph of the Will, about the Nuremberg rallies in 1935. A great piece of propaganda. It's still online. Very well filmed. Glorifies the Nazi era. We don't feel about this movie the same way that they felt about it when it was made. What about personal feelings? Okay, this is the ultimate redound. I know my wife loves me. That's knowledge, okay? This is what somebody tells you. But is that true? When a guy tells you he knows his wife loves you, what is the truth there? The truth is only that the guy is telling you that this is the way he feels. It does not mean that his wife loves him. And it requires further empirical demonstration. And one of my readers said, well, look at a group of teenage girls trying to figure out if a guy really likes one of them. They're sitting around in a circle and they're saying, well, did he call you? Did he send you flowers? Did he ask you out again? They're all looking for empirical evidence that there's really a love relationship there. And maybe somebody will be able to do this by looking at the hormone titers itself. Okay. But personal feelings are not a way of finding out truth of the universe. All you can say is that this person says that they feel this way. To see if that feeling really expresses some kind of truth about the nature, you have to go much further and use science broadly construed. I'm hungry, somebody tells you. Are they hungry? They could be making it up. You know, well, you look for empirical evidence. How much are they going to eat if you give them a plate of food? Can you look at their gastric juices, et cetera? You've heard of the expression, their eyes are bigger than their stomach. So when somebody makes a statement about their personal feeling, it does not express any knowledge about the universe at all. All it tells you is some subjective view that somebody has, and even that could be wrong because they could be lying to you. Finally, there's religion, dogma, scripture, revelation, authority. Does that provide any truth at all about the universe? That phylogeny I gave you, religion, should give you the answer. It's no. Religion does not reveal truth. We've had thousands of years theology, and now have we gotten any closer to understanding the nature of the divine, or even if there is a divine, in those thousands of years? And the answer is no. We don't know anything more about God than Thomas Aquinas knew. You know, people just, I mean, as Dan said, theology is a subject without an object. It's an endless employment of employed bureaucrats spinning their wheels, making up stuff about something that they don't know is true. Theological knowledge does not home in on any widely agreed on truths. Religion is not a way of knowing. And this is all summarized, I think, by Mike Aus, who's another apostate pastor. I can't remember his religion, but he's become an atheist, I think largely due to Dennett Lynn Lilliscola's clergy project. And he made what I consider to be a very profound statement. He said science and religion are different ways of knowing and are not in conflict with each other. This is what he was taught because they answer different questions. This is the Gouldian theory of NOMA, the non-overlapping magisteria. And so science and religion are compatible. They both are different ways of knowing. They just do different things. And then Aus figured out, well, I was dead wrong, and this is the profound statement. There are not different ways of knowing. There is knowing and there is not knowing. And those are the only two options in this world. Okay. To me, religion is not knowing, and science is knowing, or at least getting closer to understanding how the universe works. So I'll move on quickly to the second part of the talk, which is the big questions part. I hope I've convinced you that science, broadly construed, is the only reliable way of understanding the universe. What about these big questions that the religious people tell us are their bailiwick? They're there to answer the big questions. Scientists are impotent to deal with these questions. Okay, here are some of them. This is the philosopher Leszek Kowalski, Polish philosopher. He says there are questions like, who am I? Where did I come from? Where do I fit in? What does my life mean? How do I face death? And then the kicker, the more scientific discovery reveals, the more we realize it cannot answer the great existential questions. The implication, of course, here is that religion can answer the great existential questions. Well, we'll see in a minute how well it does with those. This, by the way, and I won't go into the John Templeton Foundation, which is one of my bête noirs. It's a very highly funded organization designed to blur the boundaries between science and religion. Sir John willed $1.7 billion, I think, from his mutual funds to showing how science could give evidence about the nature, the answers of the big questions. And lots of scientists take money from Templeton, and when they're doing that, they're making a bargain with the devil, in my belief. But be aware that there is an organization, one of the most highly funded private organizations in the U.S., whose purpose is to say that science can help us answer these big existential questions about life. And I think, as Sean said yesterday, they can't. Okay, what are these big questions? Here's a list of them, which came from the philosopher, Catholic liberal theologian John Hott, who said it is the main business of religion to answer the big questions. And here's some of them. I'm not going to read them. We'll get back to them in a minute. What's going on in the universe? Well, that's a really great question. Who am I? Why be moral? And this is his list, not mine. This guy's highly regarded. He gets money for thinking up this stuff. Why is there so much suffering? Why do we die? Do we live on after death? These are the great existential questions that they say religion can answer and science is impotent before. Okay, so before I get to them, what do we mean by answering the big questions? There's two ways. First of all, you can just give a response. But that's not an answer. What we want is a correct answer, right? I mean, we're after the truth here, not just some theologian saying, yeah, sure, there is a heaven and hell. Now go away and don't bother me anymore. You need to know the truth. Otherwise, there's no point in asking these questions. Do the big questions make sense? And no, some of them are meaningless and ambiguous. For example, is there a God? That question is meaningless and ambiguous unless you define what you mean by God. It can be meaningful if you say there is a certain kind of God. But if you're a pantheist, for example, like Morgan Freeman announced he was today, he's got a new series coming out, National Geographic, which is now Kissing the Ass of Religion, is having a new series on God with Morgan Freeman. He declared himself a pantheist. He said, every rose, every sunset gives evidence for God. Well, if that's your nature of God, then yeah, there is a God. But for every other kind of God, the question is ambiguous until you specify what you mean by that. Why is there something instead of nothing? I sat next to Sean at dinner last night, and I asked him this question. He said it's a meaningless question. It can be meaningful if we knew a little bit more about where the universe came from. But until we know that, a question that begins with why assumes the universe is embedded in a bigger matrix that we don't understand, and so this question is a meaningless question. Do all the big questions have objective answers? Can you answer some of these questions in a way that is reliable and agreed upon by most people? And the answer is no, because the answers differ so much from different people. How should we live? Questions about morality have no objective answer whatsoever. Okay, and I can argue that with people. Sam Harris thinks they do. I would disagree with him. What can we hope for? There's no objective to answer to that. I mean, I could hope that Donald Trump would, I don't want to hope he dies. That's not nice to do that. I would hope that, well, I don't know what I hope for, but that's an ambiguous question. There's no objective answer to it. Do some big questions with objective answers have religious rather than scientific answers? And my answer to that is no. For example, the question, where did the universe come from? I mean, you can say God, but how do you prove that? You can't, because there's no evidence for God. Is there an afterlife? Same thing. There is a scientific answer to that question, which is probably not, but the religious answers are meaningless because we cannot verify them. Just remember that all the different religions have different answers to these questions. So if you're looking for truth, if you're looking for an answer which holds broadly and not just personally for you, then you can't get it from religion. Are all the big questions with objective answers scientific or empirical questions? And the answer is yes. Here's 3 of the questions that John Hott raised. Where do I come from? Why is there so much suffering? And does the Christian God exist? Okay. Now religion would say, A, God made me. B, suffering, well, that's a tough one. Maybe it's because of free will, and it's a maladaptive byproduct. Does the Christian God exist? You betcha. But there are scientific answers to these questions that are different from those. And in the last part of the talk, I'll just tell you how religion versus science answers these big questions. Can all scientific questions be answered? We would hope so, but certainly not, because, unfortunately, there are some questions that we will never know the answer to. What were all the names of the members of Julius Caesar's army? We're never going to know that. There is an answer, there is an objective answer out there, but we do not have the data. Getting closer to my own field, how did the first self-replicating molecule evolve? How did life start? Now, we can replicate life, maybe, in the next 5 decades in the laboratory under early Earth conditions. And that will give us a clue, perhaps, to how it started. But it won't tell us how it did start, because we weren't there. It was a soft-bodied molecule. And so we'll never really know the answer to that. So some scientific questions can't be answered at all. because the answers are unfindable. Other scientific questions can not be answered at present because we simply do not have the tools to answer them. That is, the answer has not yet been found. Two of them, one of them was mentioned earlier, what is the neurological basis of consciousness? And the other one is string theory and accurate description of physics. We don't know the answer to these questions, but we may with certain advances in both neuroscience or in physics in the future. Okay, so let's go back to this list of big questions again. And I'm going to go through some of them and tell you how scientists would answer them versus how religious people would answer them. And here I'm explicitly talking only about religion versus science. Because when somebody raises the big questions issue, they're not raising it from the humanities. They're raising it from the position of religion. Their thesis is that religious doctrine could give you the answer to these questions, and science cannot. Okay? So here's all the list of John Hott's questions, and I put asterisks in red next to all of them that implicitly assume that there's a God for an answer, because the questions become unanswerable without a God. For example, is there any point to it all? Well, that question is meaningless unless you think that the answer involves that, yes, the point is given to you by some divine being, God. So most of these questions, not all of them, presume the existence of some divine being as part of the answer. And that renders those questions meaningless because we have no evidence for such a divine being. Okay, now, I put black asterisks next to a subset of these questions, which can be answered by science. And I'm going to give you the scientific answer versus the religious answer, even though religious people aren't going to like the scientific answers. And sometimes the scientific answers will seem fatuous. But they're answers, and they're correct answers. So if they don't satisfy your inner need for understanding the point of it all, that's just too damn bad. Here's the first one. What's going on in the universe? That's John Hott's first question. Here's the way he would answer it. God's doing his thing. Everything's being, not a sparrow falls without God wanting it to fall. Here's how Sean Carroll would answer it. And most scientists, the laws of physics are operating. That's what's going on. That's not going to satisfy somebody that wants a religious answer, but that happens to be the best answer that scientists can give to this question. Why are we here? Religious people, God put us here. We're the object of God's affection. We were made in the image of God, and that's why humans are here. Religious answer, we evolved from a primate ancestor who came from another ancestor, an insectivore, another mammal, and then a reptile, and an amphibian and fish, and it all came back to the universal common ancestor, the ancestor of us all that lived about probably 4 billion years ago, perhaps. Okay, that is the answer to that question. It's the only sensible answer that we can give, the only answer that everybody can agree upon. It's not going to answer the question of a religious person, why are we here? But you tell me any kind of priest or imam or guru that can give you an answer, why are we here, that everybody agrees upon. Okay, there isn't any such thing. Where did I come from? God made you, right? That's the religious answer. Here's the correct answer. Your parents. There's a little wine, a little Sinatra, and then, there's no predicting. So that's, I don't know about my parents. This is likely for my parents because they're Sinatra fans, but I wasn't there. But of course, there's another answer. That's an approximate answer. Here's the ultimate answer, which is evolution. That's where we came from. Okay. And these answers sound fatuous, right? But they happen to be the correct answers. If you're going to ask questions like this, and you want an answer that is scientifically verifiable and agreed upon by all people, then this is the kind of answer you have to give. Why does anything exist at all? Where does the universe come from? These are questions. And the religious answer is, well, God made it all. He started everything. He made the universe. Why something exists instead of nothing is because God said, let there be something. Okay. Well, we have no way of verifying that. And according to Sean, even that question makes no sense at all until we learn a little bit more about physics. So his answer is, we don't know squat about the answer to these questions. And it is no crime in science, and it shouldn't be in life, to admit that you do not know something. Okay. Of course, saying that and adopting that as your maxim will put every theologian in the world out of business. So we don't know. The universe came from the Big Bang, but where the Big Bang came from, we don't know the answer. How should we live? The way God wants us to. That's religious doctrine. But of course, the way an imam would answer that question is different than the way a priest would answer that question. It's different from the way a rabbi would answer this question. The scientific answer is, There isn't any objective answer in how should you live. It's a matter of preference about how you want to live. But once you decide what preference you have, for example, if you say, I want to help the maximum number of people I can, like Peter Singer's question, then science can go to work and try to help you through empirical investigation of how you can accomplish these goals once you've set them. Why be moral? Because God wants you to be. That's the religious answer. The scientific answer, well, there isn't any really. I mean, if you're moral, you tend to get along better with your fellow human beings. You create a society in which people get along. It's a much more harmonious society, and your reputation increases if you're known as a moral person. So those are 3 good reasons to be moral. But what do you do with those people that don't care if they're moral or not? They don't want to be liked by everybody else, and they don't want to adhere to the moral norms of society, and that's their preference. Maybe their preference is to kick dogs or something. There is no objective way to say that they're wrong. You can say that they're wrong if they want to achieve certain goals, but just to say that, how should you live is not a question that science can really answer. And what it means even to be moral varies so much amongst the different religions. I mean, if you're a Muslim, the vast majority of Muslims outside the United States think that being a practicing homosexual is immoral, as does the Catholic Church. Most people don't believe that. So, even the nature of morality is a question that cannot be adjudicated by religion. Why is there evil? Well, even the notion of evil depends on some sort of human value judgment. Why do bad things happen? Religious people, they're not sure why it's evil. This is the problem of theodicy. Why does God let bad things happen to people? Like, why do kids die of leukemia when they haven't done anything wrong? Why do tsunamis kill thousands of innocent people? And they don't really have any answer to that. They can say, well, there are evil people in the world because that's the unfortunate byproduct of God giving us free will. I'll let Dan Barker handle that answer. But religions don't really have an answer. This is the Achilles heel, I think, of theology, because it cannot explain in a way that does not make you laugh, if you're a rational person, why kids die of leukemia. Why an omniscient, omnipotent, and beneficent God would let this stuff happen is beyond the canon. But people get paid to make up answers for this. It's infuriating. Why is there evil? Okay, yeah. So evil is a human construct of bad things happening. Bad things happen because of the laws of physics. You get mutations that cause cancer. Tsunamis are the result of earthquakes, which are the result of the shifting of the tectonic plates of the earth. This is the correct answer to this question. We construe this as evil, as physical evil, as opposed to moral evil. Now, why are people evil? Well, some people have the genes and the environments that just make them sociopaths or psychopaths, and they do bad things. And that's the reason that there's moral evil as opposed to personal evil. Why is there so much suffering in the world? Well, religious people don't really have any answer to that. I mean, if God was really beneficent, he wouldn't have to take us to heaven. He'd make earth heaven, and we'd all live here forever in harmony on clouds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The scientific answer, why there is suffering, involves evolution. A lot of suffering comes from your pain receptors. Why do we have pain receptors? Because they're ways that evolution has put in our body to tell us that something is wrong. If you stick your hand in a fire, you want it to hurt because you want to get your hand out of that fire as fast as possible, or you're going to damage your body. So pain, at least physical pain, is a result of natural selection, telling you that parts of the universe are trying to hurt you and you want to get away from them. Okay? And emotional pain may be the same thing, a way of protecting your feelings, of drawing inwards upon times of great sorrow. We don't know about that. But at least these are scientific answers to a question that cannot be answered by religious. Does God exist? Religious people, no doubt, God exists, of course. Now, we have no we cannot prove that God does not exist scientifically. Let's just say that everything points to the non-existence of God, at least of the beneficent Abrahamic type of God. He could have given us evidence of his existence. He could write, I am that I am in the stars, as somebody has pointed out. There could be stuff in the Bible that was not intelligible to the people who supposedly wrote the Bible at the time. There could be prophecies that have come true. There could be unexplained miracle healings. Lots of things could have happened, but didn't happen. And when there, as I think, who was it that said when there should be evidence? I think it was Victor Stenger, that the absence of evidence for God is evidence of the absence of God if there should be evidence for the existence of God, and there should. And this led the philosopher of Alabama, Dallas McCown, to make this quip: the invisible and the non-existent look very much alike. Okay. Which is more parsimonious, the non-existence or the existence of some impossibly complex deity for which we have no evidence? Do we live on after death? Religious answer, of course we do, unless you're Jewish, of course. Then you go to sleep. Scientific answer, probably not, because we don't have any evidence for it, and there should be. Maybe somebody should have come back from the dead. Why do we die? Religious answer, well, I'm not sure that religion has come up with an answer of why we die rather than why we live forever on this earth. But genetics has an answer. Antagonistic pleiotropy. That is, because if you start your life, it's likely that at some point you're going to have an accident or you're going to die. If you're an animal, somebody's going to eat you, you're going to fall off a cliff, you're going to drown, a predator or a parasite will get you. What that means is that those genes that make you reproduce as early as you can in life will be favored even if they cause you to degenerate later on in life. Because later on in life it doesn't matter so much, you're probably going to be dead anyway. This is called antagonistic pleiotropy, and you can prove it scientifically by selecting, for example, in fruit flies, for them to reproduce earlier in life. And when you do that, you see that they become senile or senescent faster than other flies. So it's the fact that genes can't do everything. Some genes will make you reproduce early and then senesce. Some genes will make you reproduce late and make you not reproduce early. But those aren't going to be favored, because if you reproduce late, you might be dead anyway. So we have a scientific answer to the fact about why we die. It's because we have the accumulation of genes that are going to make us wear out and susceptible to disease at the expense, because they also promote reproduction when they're earlier. And I won't go into this anymore. You can look it up on the internet. I'm almost fine. How do we find release from suffering and sadness? Religious answer, go to church. Believe in God. Secular answer, there's lots of them. And these are true. I mean, these things work. Finally, the last question, what can we hope for? Religious answer, well, I don't know how really religious people answer that. Well, for God to help us out, and someday if we're really, really good people, we're going to be up there in that cloud playing the harp. Our little dog will be with us. Our parents will be with us. We'll be in some form. I like to think that if we were going to go to heaven, I would be 25 years old again and be that age forever, but we could be 80, who knows. And incontinent, I guess you're not incontinent in heaven. The real answer to the real scientific answer, what could we hope for, is more of the same, basically. I mean, we'll get some surprises, and here's a really bad one that we had a couple of months ago. But, joyful and surprise. I mean, what can we hope for is almost a meaningless question. All we can say is things are going to go on pretty much as they have been in the last 5 years, but there's going to be some punctuated equilibrium. So the conclusions of this talk, and I'm right at the end now, are this. First of all, there's no way of knowing anything that's true about the universe except by using science broadly construed. That's the answer to the first part of the talk. If you think you have a truth about the universe that comes from music, that comes from literature, that comes from any place other than science broadly construed, by all means let me know what that is. And I'll admit it if I agree with you. Now, and part of the things about the big questions, first of all, the vast majority of these big questions presuppose the existence of a God, because the questions make no sense unless they can be answered with a God answer. Since there's no evidence for God, those questions then become moot. Second of all, the answers to these religious questions diverge amongst different faiths. So there aren't really answers, because you don't get a consensus view of these answers the way you would get a consensus view to the answer of what is the molecular formula of a normal water molecule. Okay. Third of all, the religious answers aren't testable, so therefore they're not credible. If you cannot test a religious answer, like saying, is there an afterlife? And you say yes, well, then you ask the preacher, well, tell me, how do you know that? And the preacher won't be able to tell you. He'll say, well, I see it in Scripture, or I feel it in my head, or some other non-credible answer than that. But they're not satisfying, at least to anybody who's scientifically minded. Insofar as religious answers involve morality or similar subjective matters, secular humanism gives on average better answers than religion does. And I think this is manifestly true. I mean, you just have to look at the way gays have been treated, the way women have been treated. The secular humanism answer is not only better than the religious answer, but it precedes it. So religion's always playing catch-up with with secular humanism. And when you see religious people pick and choose the bits of scripture that they like, and I've seen this over and over again, if they say, well, you know, you have to look at the Quran the right way, you have to look at the Bible the right way, you discard these parts about the guy getting killed for picking up sticks on the Sabbath, and you keep the love thy neighbor part. Well, what happens is, what you're doing is just taking out a pre-existing secular morality that was already there before the Bible was written. So religion cannot give you any moral answers that are any better than secular humanism. And finally, all objective answers to these scientific questions, as I've tried to make in a sort of fatuous way, require empirical testing or checking. And finally, some scientific answers simply aren't obtainable now or in principle. So with that, I'll end. And I just want to add one meme. And I'm not sure if this came from Richard Dawkins, but he's made himself famous by saying it, I think in a debate with Neil deGrasse Tyson, which is science, it works, bitches. That is, it tells us truths about the universe, and no other method can do that. No other method can answer the big questions we have about the universe, except for science broadly construed. Thanks very much.
Jerry Coyne, ladies and gentlemen, Jerry Coyne. Very nice. And there we go.